Do we have everybody? Yes, I think so. Well, anyway, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the BSHS Digital Festival 2023. This session is displaying the Gravid Uterus, and I'm going to hand over to Sophie, who will get us started.
Hi, I think we're just waiting for Lola to join, but I'll begin while we're just waiting for Lola. Oh, there she is, great. Hello, everyone. My name is Sophie Goggins, and I'm the Senior Curator of Biomedical Science at National Museum Scotland. I'm joined today with my colleagues, Dr. Lola Sanchez-Jauregui, and who's Curator of Art Collections at the Hunterian Museum and Art Gallery, Dr. Nicky Reeves, who's Curator of Scientific and Medical History Collections at the Hunterian Museum and Art Gallery, a theme, and Abigayle Brown, who's Collections Management Support Assistant at the Hunterian Museum and Art Gallery, who is helping us today with supplementary links. The presentation today will discuss at length issues of consent, sexual violence, and graphic images, and will include graphic images. It includes brief images of the cast that we're talking about, and drawings of dissected bodies, including genitalia and depictions of fetuses. It also includes examples of dehumanizing language. We've chosen to not put images of the material we're discussing front and center today. Abigayle will kindly be popping a link in the resource at the bottom of the screen, the resource tab, so you can engage with images of the casts if you wish to. If you choose to engage with the content, feel free to view them, but you do not need to view the images in order to participate or get the most out of the session. There will be images of the cast in situ in galleries in each of our talks, but we will let you know before they are shown. We'd also like to preamble by saying that, as always, we want this to be a respectful space. Everyone's reaction to this material is different and valid. We are all allowed to have a plurality of feeling about this material, its creation, and its display. And that no disrespectful language or disparaging of people's feelings in the Q&A. Now that we are done with that, today you will hear from each of us about our experience, research, success, and challenges of displaying Gravid Uterus casts at different venues over the last decade. We will begin with Lola talking about her research into how the casts were created and their display and international tour. Nicky will then speak about their display at the Hunterian, and I will then talk about their display at National Museum Scotland. If Abigayle could share the PowerPoint, that'd be grand. Cool. Delightful. So next slide, please, Abigayle. Thank you. As a short introduction to our subject today, the image you can see is of the book, The Anatomy of the Gravid Uterus Exhibited in Figures, which was produced by William Hunter in 1774. William Hunter was a Scottish-born physician and obstetrician, and this book was an oversized, expensive publication and only printed in limited quantities, so not widely available beyond medical professionals. The copy you are seeing right now is a slightly later version from 1815. The 1774 book took 24 years to produce and transformed the way that physicians thought about female anatomy and childbirth. It contained 34 engravings of the human pregnant gravid uterus from early to late stage pregnancy. The engravings were taken from drawings made of dissections of unknown women. The information included about the women varies. Some include cause of death, some do not. What made the book special was that earlier depictions of the uterus were drawn sometimes as imagined and were therefore rarely accurate. In contrast, William Hunter insisted that the artist of this book drew directly from dissections and not from memory. So there's a resource link if you want to go look at the book and the engravings there. The casts we are talking about today are a set of 11 life-size plaster casts of the dissected bodies of unknown women in different stages of pregnancy. 3 of the casts directly relate to this book. The casts were gifted to the Hunterian at the University of Glasgow in 1807. The casts vary in the amount of body shown. Some just include the uterus, some and parts of the leg, while others include the full torso. We know very little to nothing about the women from who the casts were taken. On to Lola.
Thank you. Everybody hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Sophie, and thank you everyone for being there. Thank you, Sophie, for inviting me to be part of this session. Yes, so I joined the Hunterian 6 years ago, and I was going to work in a collaborative exhibition project between the Yale Center for British Art at the Yale University and the Hunterian, and that would mark the tercentenary of the birth of our founder, William Hunter. And I was co-curator and co-editor of the catalogue, and in that capacity I was responsible for the selection of objects and for the ultimate installation of the objects on display. And with that goal in mind, we knew from the outset that we wanted to showcase the collecting, the activities as collector by William Hunter. But like Sophie said, the Gravid Uterus was his main contribution to the field of obstetrics. And we knew right from the beginning that it was going to feature prominently in the exhibition. What you have in the screen is an image of the original book, published in 1744, an image depicting one of these plates, included one of the 34 plates, included the print and the chalk drawing in which it was based, the original, which is in the collection of the University of Glasgow. In the right-hand side, what you see is the interior of the Anatomy Museum as it looked like when I first arrived to the Hunterian, and that's where when I first encountered those plaster casts exhibited inside a cabinet, wooden cabinet protected by glass and in a vertical position. And I think I should say at this point, I'm an art historian from my background, but I'm very, very used to work with cross-disciplinary collection. But when I first encountered these objects, I was shocked. They were very powerful images, and I struggled, and I was concerned about the challenges to display these objects. So I turned to my colleagues at the university and the Hunterian, expressing my concerns, but the reply that I got from most of the people was that the objects had been on display and there had never been any problems, and that everybody understood perfectly well the context of this, and so therefore I should not be worrying about that. Recover from that first initial encounter, then I thought I should just proceed. The checklist of the exhibition was something like 400, and try to understand more about how these casts were made as a way to engage with them and be more ready to display them in a better way. If you can go to the next slide, Abigayle. Thank you. So I team up with colleagues from the Technical Art History department at the university, and we started carrying on research on technical examination. So on this slide, you see on the top left image, colleagues from collections management removing the casts from their display at the Anatomy Museum, and an image of my colleague, Dr. Mark Pritchard, leaning on one of the plaster casts, taking samples of the polychromy on the surface of the cast. And then on the right-hand side, Dr. Goggins is just looking at his screen while one of the casts is going through the tomographical sketch, to computer tomography, the scanner, sorry. And then underneath, there are the three imaging resulting from this analysis. On the left-hand side, what you see is an X-ray of the cast that show the interior, and also how they have been attached to the backboard, to the wooden backboard when we found them. Right next to it, there is a magnification of a cross-section of the cast, where you can see different layers that correspond to the different paint layers. One of the discoveries at this point was to find out that the last layer was a restoration that was carried on probably at the end of the 19th century, implying that these casts were used for the teaching, and therefore people was still using them and conserving them. On the right-hand side, what you have is a CT scan image, and these kind of images what reveal are the density. So it revealed different densities in the kind of cast of the plaster that has been used, indicating that the breast area and the dissected area were made from different molds and from different densities, which again pointed to the fact that these casts were made from multiple molds, and how difficult and how many skills required in the making of this cast. This information was all very useful to think about the possibilities of display, but also, and even more crucially, to think about how to conserve this cast, to hold the deterioration, but also to make sure that they were stable for traveling and for the show. Can we go to the next slide, Abigayle? So what you see in the screen now are some snapshots of the conservation process that took course over several months. And on the left-hand side, what you see is one of the conservators removing the cast from the backboard where it was attached. In the next image, you see a screenshot of the interior of the cast for the first time revealed. what we learned from that is that the wooden beams that are added on top and the lower end were later additions. That was key, because that indicated that those wooden beams were added only for the purpose to be able to attach the cast to the backboard. And then that, therefore, we had evidence that the backboard and this vertical positioning that some of us were struggling with, we expressed from the beginning that the positioning seemed odd. And that was, first of all, prompted by the gravity of the physical body of the breast, but also because of the, if thinking about what the purposes of the cast was and how Hunter would have used them in his anatomical lecture theatre, we were nearly sure that they might have been displayed in the dissecting table. This conservation process confirmed that, and therefore a very important next step took place in the knowledge of this cast. Sorry, before we go on the right-hand side, there are some images of the different treatments of trying to address paint losses and toning up some of the areas. Can we go to the next slide, Abigayle? So once furnished with the evidence, with the research, then we came to the next step, and that was a crucial step. We decided to move on and change the positioning of this cast from vertical to horizontal. And the consequences that this change of positioning had was, I think, something that we didn't expect, really, because all of a sudden the viscerality of those casts was brought back, and the violence of them was even more explicit, and the way of engaging with the casts all brought back to a situation, to an original situation that enhanced the difficulties or the uncomfortable situation when you look at them. So we worked together with a team of specialists here, and we came up with the final display on the right-hand side. Before I move on, I should say that at this stage, we were very aware that we knew a lot about how the casts were made, but very little, like Sophie said, about who were these women, how these bodies were, how Hunter get access to those bodies, if there was any consent. We had no information, and yet we had to provide with interpretation for this cast in the exhibition. I said at the beginning that we worked together with the Yale Center for British Art, and so that implied that we traveled several times to New Haven, and we met there with colleagues. And the conversations there soon revealed the difficulties and the challenges that those casts presented, to the point that in a series of conversations with members of faculty, the challenge was expressed in such a way that our colleagues there thought on the possibility of not including any of the cast. Then they moved on to decide that they would only include one cast. And then the next step was to think about protecting the cast with a screen, so that to give the visitors the option to decide whether they want to see it or not. Can we go to the next slide, Abigayle? So that kind of conversations were really a contrast from the conversations that we had in Glasgow. And this is the wonderful things about collaboration. I think those conversations really informed and changed, at least slightly, the approach in Glasgow. So on the left-hand side, you see the displays at the Hunterian Gallery. The approach here was to try to recover the historical context, including all the different elements of the project, from plaster casts to anatomical preparations, prints, and drawings. But informed by those conversations at New Haven, we also put together a display on the Gallery 2, on the top floor of the Hunterian, where a contemporary artist, Claire Barclay, responded with some prints to these objects. And we also, once the exhibition opened, we had a collaboration with the Glasgow Women's Library, who came and formed, they arranged a conversation around the feminist decoding of this cast. On the right-hand side, you see how at the end, my colleagues at the Centre for British Art decided not to include that screen. It was built, it was brought to the rooms, but at the last minute, they decided not to display them. And I'm coming to the end. Next slide, Abigayle. I think it's fair to say that for me, this cast has been the most challenging object that I have ever had to create in a show. That my conversations with Sophie and with Nicky, as you will see, have been constantly informing my opinion about this cast. And I just want to show you some images of that I spotted on the opening of the exhibition, where with all these concerns in my head, I encountered this scene where a mother was explaining to a daughter, pointing very naturally to these images, and as probably talking about how the gestation of the human womb. And yes, this is just to address how complicated and how many different views were discussed there. Thank you.
I'm going to go straight into me, Sophie. Is that okay? Brilliant. Thanks, Lola. So, hello, everybody. Lovely to be here. I'm Nicky Reeves. I'm a curator at the Hunterian. For those that can't see me, I'm a white man with short hair and glasses in front of some books. I'm going to make reference to violence, butchery, and mutilation, but not at great length. And I'll be showing some slides of the Gravid Uterus casts in situ in the gallery right at the end. I've got 3 topics to talk about just now for 10 minutes. The first one is we've not received any complaints, or making it explicit, making it worse. Describing and naming GLAHM 125628, and then very briefly at the end, turning the tables. So Lola's emphasized the significance of the shift from the vertical to the horizontal. And orientation radically affects meaning, and orientation in the gallery likewise is unsurprisingly hugely important. Following the 2018 show in Glasgow and then the traveling version in Yale in August 2019, at very short notice, 3 of the Gravid Uterus casts were put on display in an upstairs corridor gallery at the Hunterian. And this was, we all agree, essentially a disaster. Instead of being under subdued lighting, they were in a very bright corridor with dark red blood-colored lino on the floor. And being in a corridor, they were completely unavoidable. They had to be encountered or engaged with to get from one part of the museum to another. And there was a lot of noise around them, visual noise, but also just a genuinely echoey place. And most of all, they were placed in the gallery at short notice in August 2018 without any labeling or interpretation. This was not a very good way of doing things. Several people from the Hunterian thought it was a bit of a mistake. I volunteered at the very minimum to prepare some new labels for this ad hoc impromptu display. And it was at that point it became apparent that there were some issues with the 2018 labeling, some particularities, which I'll talk about in the next section. But what I wanted to do is talk about an utterance, and Lola just mentioned this for discussion, which was made both before, during, and after the 2018 show, which is no one has complained before, or we've not received any complaints. And considering this with respect to reception, yes, it's true, you have not received any complaints, and that's sometimes because you've chosen not to hear them or not to recognize complaints as complaints. Visitors might find an exhibition problematic and choose just never to come back. It might not result in a complaint. Visitors are often extremely deferential towards the institution. If they don't like something, they don't understand it, they might internalize the problem. Plenty of people within the museum itself found the display in 2019 as problematic, but their testimony, again, wasn't necessarily received or acknowledged as credible testimony. And this was partly the age-old issue of not listening to front of house, but there was also sometimes a gendered aspect to it. Colleagues speaking as a woman, as someone who's given birth, as someone who is a parent, often or sometimes express certain disquiet, but there's a way in which the situatedness of their testimony sometimes was used to undermine it. The temporality of no one has complained before was also evident. If no one's complained before, why are you complaining now? And this is just another example of complaining in the wrong way. You've complained too formally, too informally, too early, too late. You know, you can't win this. Lastly, on this issue, there's a way in which if you reiterate in a museum that something is not a problem, that it becomes axiomatic or definitional. So no one complained about them becomes a property of the objects. There was also both before and during and after the 2018 show, a tension within the museum between displaying the items and being explicit about what the items were. And there was a strange tension sometimes whereby some people were quite comfortable with depictions of headless women, and sometimes genital mutilation on display, but quite grave discomfort about explicitly describing them that way. And I think the word explicit is quite useful here, partly because it's a word we associate with violence and with sex and with pornography, but also because one of the conclusions from all of this was that being explicit isn't necessarily always the best thing to do. The problem was the location of the objects in 2019, and introducing labeling which made clear what the things were didn't necessarily make things better. And Sophie's going to talk about the consequences of that in the next section. Okay, so that's 4 minutes, 46 seconds. My second section is right. The third section is really short. Let's stay on that slide. Oh no, can we go forward one slide, please, Abigayle? There we go. So describing and naming Hunterian GLAHM 125628. So let's look at some labeling issues. On the screen in front of us are 4 different versions of the label for this item, which I'll talk through from 2018 at the top, 1900, late 18th century manuscript, and the 2019 labels right down the bottom. And I'll just keep those up on the screen for a bit whilst I'm talking. So in the example from 2018, which was in the publication for the big exhibition at the Hunterian and also some of the labels on display, you can see that 125628 is not a model of the uterus, it is the uterus. It's a universal exemplary uterus. It's also obviously not a model of a woman or a part of a woman. Woman here is reduced to a uterus. So it's an object, it's objectified, it's made into a specimen, and the act of turning it into a specimen absents the woman. It's also, you see in this top 2018 example, Hunter's first subject. So this is a possession, and also there's a presence and an absence of names and identities. Hunter is named, the woman is not named. Hunter has agency, the woman does not. And the absence of women's names was remarked on quite a lot in the 2018 exhibition and in the feminist analysis by the Glasgow Women's Library that Lola mentioned. So it was pretty obvious that from the decontextualization from the rest of the 2018 exhibition, that when these things were put into the 2019 redisplay, these labels were not going to be quite adequate for this sudden redisplay. What hadn't been obvious was that the 2018 phrasing didn't come from the 18th century, from Hunter's period. It came from 1900. So you can see that in the second example on this list. And it shouldn't be particularly surprising for this audience of historians of science that the catalogue written in 1900 was particularly objectifying and dehumanizing. It's not that surprising if you know much about the trend and direction of 19th century science. But it had nevertheless been treated as this 1900 depiction as the kind of authentic original, whilst in fact there was a late 18th century manuscript in the Glasgow University Library which had quite strikingly different language, which firstly emphasized the particularity of the items, but also emphasized or made reference to the fact that there was a woman there, or there was a child or an infant or a fetus. So that was really useful to realize. Because the 18th century language was much closer to the kind of language we needed to develop for this new decontextualized display. Amongst other things, we really needed to make it clear to the audience that these women had not been murdered. This is not obvious to people walking past them, and also that the women were not merely reduced to being the same thing as their uterus. So the 18th century label, you can see in the third section, has a cast in plaster Paris, coloured after light. After life takes the lower half of the trunk of the body, ... So we went with something quite similar right at the end in 2019, a plaster cast made from the body of an unknown woman who died during the 9th month of pregnancy. And this was an attempt to do something a bit better. We also discussed at quite some length the distinction between unknown, unnamed, and unidentified. And unidentified seems a bit passive. It also implies that there's been an attempt to identify the women, which is not necessarily true. A choice, in fact, might have been made to make them anonymous. Unidentified also perhaps implies that it's necessary to identify the women in order to treat them with respect and dignity. And that's not necessarily true. We can afford dignity in lots of ways in which we both care for and handle and label and talk about things. There's also this really strong tendency with unidentified, and it's a very scientistic tendency to think that that more knowledge will lead to justice with respect to human remains. And there's lots of comparisons here. There's often this well-meaning belief that further analysis, further sampling, further DNA will lead to insights and identification which will encourage justice and respect. And that's not necessarily the right thing to do. And lastly, talking about the distinction between unnamed, unidentified, and unknown, we felt that unnamed seemed like the wrong term because these women clearly had names, we just don't know them. So that's why we went with unknown. So lastly, can we go forward a couple of slides, Abigayle? I think there's another one, yeah, and one more. Turning the tables. Okay, so very lastly, this is the 2019 situation that I've described as being not very adequate and at points quite inappropriately laid out. You'll see on the left 2019 August, on the right October 2019. Very briefly, I just wanted to talk about interventions and agency when things are far from ideal. So one way to respond to inappropriate decisions, like putting objects on display at short notice with no labels, that's an inappropriate decision, is to appeal to protocol. Another way is just to be equally renegade, and I think that's quite good sometimes. So with respect to orientation, which we've talked about, the particular way in August 2019 in which two of the casts were positioned in the gallery, particularly in your face, particularly so that the viscerality, as Lola puts it, and the actual literal meatiness of these objects was particularly close to the visitor. And an unnamed colleague X, decided it should be moved and turned it round and reoriented it by both of them by 90 degrees. And you'll see that happen between August and October at some point. And I think this kind of turning of the tables, just doing something with absolutely correct and lawful and appropriate museum handling techniques, brought back a lot of agency to what was quite an uncomfortable time in the museum, and I think was really good. And I'll end on that point.
Hello, everyone. Back again. So Anatomy, A Matter of Death and Life was an exhibition at National Museum Scotland that was on over the summer of 2022. The exhibition highlighted 500 years of anatomical study, from artistic explorations by Leonardo da Vinci to the infamous Westport murders. It examined social and medical history surrounding the practice of dissection of human bodies, and it looked at Edinburgh's role as an international centre for medical study and offered insight into the links between science and crime in the 19th century. So where does the gravid uterus fit with all of this? So the suggested position for an inclusion of a cast was in section 2 of the exhibition, which looked at Edinburgh, the Enlightenment, and set up for section 3, which was called Supply and Demand, which spoke about the issues of supply and demand on bodies in Edinburgh in the 19th century. As part of all of our work about this exhibition, we recognize that the male body was predominantly viewed as archetype by anatomists over the period covered, except when considering reproduction. With very few exceptions, the people who dissected dead bodies were the models for the other objects and subjects in this exhibition were unlikely to have given their consent. So some of the issues that Nicky and Lola spoke about were already kind of in our minds when we were thinking about what objects we would use or request. But the work of William Hunter was incredibly important, both in terms of our Scottish story in the narrative of the exhibition, but also to incorporate the study of women's bodies into our exhibition narrative. But it was never a for sure thing that a cast would be included. Abigayle, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So to display or not to display? We had been as a team to see the Hunter exhibition in Glasgow and had a variety of different feelings and opinions about their inclusion in this show, ranging from very positive to very negative. So it was something we discussed a lot. This was the first point where I spoke to Nicky about his experience that you've just heard about of displaying the casts and his preliminary advice, which was incredibly kind of him to share. He suggested that we put the cast, if requested, in a cul-de-sac or an area where it could be avoided if people wanted to. He was also very open about lessons learned from previous displays and things he would do differently. It was incredibly helpful for him to share these things, and I know that our display benefited greatly from his openness and expertise. So as a first step at NMS, I decided to bring together a group of staff, both within and outside the exhibition team, who represented people who had given birth, who had not given birth, and who had experienced miscarriage. We sat down in a meeting room and I explained why we would want to display a cast in this exhibition and what we were hoping to do with our interpretation. We went through images of all of the casts and discussed what might be the best option and issues. We made some decisions at that point in the process. First of all, chiefly, that we only needed one cast to tell the story. One of the concerns, actually having seen the Hunter exhibition that you guys have now seen an image of as well, was that actually altogether, they're quite overwhelming. I mean, just one is quite overwhelming, but more than one is incredibly overwhelming. We decided that we wanted to request a cast that showed more of the women's body than less, did not include the more graphic amputation of the legs shown in some casts, showed the fetus, but not in as much detail as other examples. As part of that conversation, we also decided that people should be able to bypass the material and put the cast in a cul-de-sac would be the best idea. We decided to request the loan of a cast from a set of 3, which the description online is, quote, "They differ in style from other casts and show the female trunk from the neck to mid-thigh, with details of internal organs and genitalia being limited." Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Yeah. From the beginning, the cast was classed on our risk register as a possible problem object. As a result, I ran sensitive content meetings with members of staff from across the museum about the material, not just limited to the gravid uterus in the exhibition. Once again, checking in with Nicky here about lessons learned was invaluable. So a Q&A sheet was created for marketing and our VE or front of staff team, covering what the casts were, why we made our choices, and specific examples around the language that we used. So it included questions like, did the real people depicted in drawings and models give their consent? The exhibition actually included only 2 examples of human remains, the skeleton of William Burke, and legally human remains, maybe not viewed as much as such, is a letter written in his blood. But the general consensus was that the object that would be the most contentious was this cast. It's also worth saying at this point, you can probably tell from my accent that I'm American, and that in the summer, our audience, especially over the summer, July, August, we get a lot of Americans in the museum. Americans have a particular relationship with depictions of female bodies this way, especially ones that include a fetus. So it was something that we were very conscious of preparing our front of house staff for any issues that might arise. We really wanted them to feel prepared and confident. So we discussed at length if there should be a warning label outside the exhibition due to the content, and eventually decided no, but went back and forth quite a lot on including one in the exhibition space. I was very pro including a warning label, and thankfully it was decided in the end that to have the material in a separate space but not indicate why would probably negate having a separate space in the first place. We had also hoped by placing the warning label where you can see it, it's in the red box there, it would draw people's attention to the space so that it wasn't always missed, so that if you wanted to engage in the content, you could. Can I have the next slide, please, Abigayle? As part of these meetings with staff, it became clear what people wanted to know about the display. The introductory panel outside of that section covered the book Hunter produced, who it was for, and its importance, but it also made a point that all images were taken from dissections of unknown women, as Nicky said. For the chalk drawings, we knew more about the women who had been dissected and chose to highlight what we knew about them in the object labels. For the cast object label, we were given more than our usual 25 word limit, and were given 100 words, which we used exactly 100 words to describe the 2 things that our internal staff unfamiliar with the objects had wanted to know. What did we know about the women, and how were the casts made? To be able to write both portions, Nicky and Lola provided, once again, invaluable help. Nicky shared previous object labels and his thoughts on word usage, which made us really consider our own language across the whole exhibition. And Lola was kind enough to share her research into how the casts were made, which allowed us to explain in simple language the process. I had always said that these were one of the objects that is upsetting to look at, but became more upsetting the more you knew about them. And we hoped our interpretation would allow visitors to understand the meaning and process of creating the casts, but make their own decision. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, thank you. This is the brief image of the cast on display. As you can see, the cast is displayed under what is meant to embody skylights of an artist's studio. It gave us both the benefit to be able to diffuse the light and keep it at a low level requested for both the casts and the paper material. The far wall is where that bright spotlight is. It was placed there so it could be well lit to draw people's attention, but not interfere with the light levels needed for the cast. It was one of the things we really thought about, is that putting the label by the cast meant that people maybe wouldn't be able to read it in the dim lighting. We really did want people to read this label. You've heard a lot today about all of our processes, and our process at NMS to ensure that the cast's we give the cast justice and in the most respectful way possible. But the big question, did anyone notice? So Abigayle, could I have the next slide, please? In short, yes, visitors did notice, which is always thrilling. All of these responses were gathered as part of visitor feedback to just 2 open-ended questions, which was, what did you like about the exhibition? And what would have improved your visit? While the first quote acknowledges the sensitive presentation, which is lovely, the second piece of feedback from a woman who had recently gone through a miscarriage and did indeed avoid the space is exactly why we did this work in the first place. Abigayle, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. But of course, there will always be negative feedback. We did acknowledge that by putting the material in a cul-de-sac, it might have one of 2 effects. It could sensationalize it more than it already was, or it could accidentally hide it away, making it easy for people to miss. What we did find out was by leaving that doorway open, at one point it was discussed about putting a curtain, people did miss that section out, but on balance, it was a compromise we felt comfortable with, as it meant no one was confronted with the material that they might not want to encounter. Abigayle, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. When we were presenting on our sensitivity approach in another internal meeting, I was asked by a colleague if we were putting in the effort around sensitivity because, quote, we need to be seen to be doing it, or do you actually care? Well, I assured them, as I will assure you all, that I do actually very much care. And I'll read the final piece of feedback aloud, an answer to the question, what did you like about the exhibition? The sensitivity to treating the subjects of dissection as actual human beings. I thought it was important that they were even specifically indicated in drawings of other images, for example, famous anatomist alongside the body of an unknown man. The focus on the importance of consent, as well as the final portion on body donation, similarly ensured that the exhibition was not a gruesome spectacle, but a true learning experience with real sensitivity. I would like to really take a minute to just credit Nicky and Lola for being so open about their own work and allowing us to take the lessons that they'd learned about personhood and the importance of language forward throughout the whole exhibition. And just to finish, Nicky and I have spoken to students about these casts in a lesson, and Nicky sometimes ends his class with what we call a cat palate cleanser. So just before the Q&A and giving you a minute to gather your thoughts, Abigayle, could I have the next slide, please? Just as a little cat palate cleanser, this is my research assistant, Archie. He's terrible at making tea, but has been very helpful at thinking through the big questions that we've been doing and talking about today. So for anyone who's following around on YouTube, apparently you can follow the link to ask a question. And yeah, I think that's the end of our slides. So thank you, Abigayle. Well, while maybe we're thinking about if there's some questions coming through, I have one for Lola and Nicky. Were there sensitivity warnings for your displays of the cast, especially at Yale, Lola?
I don't think so. No, I think, yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think we had something very little at the beginning in the Hunterian, at the entrance. And I think, I'm trying to remember now. I think there was at the Yale Center, yes.
Yeah, there was something really small at the 2019, but so 2018, sorry. For 2019, I did propose a sign, and that call, which was on, I think, my last slide. I think we went straight past it, and it was. Let's be constructive about it. I proposed a sign which said, on display in this gallery are models of pregnant women's dissected bodies. Some visitors may consider these items challenging or upsetting. And obviously there's an important point sometimes where you don't actually want to tell people what to think. So that language is perhaps not quite right. I feel a bit more confident these days with content signs where you just kind of say it straight. You just say, this is what we've got. make your own mind up. It's more of a classification, and to predict that people will be either offended or upset, even if you're couching that in terms of only a few of them, it's not necessarily helpful, because also, as we know in museums, you never know what people are going to be upset by. Sometimes it's the most weird things. But constructively, that did raise quite a lot of disquiet in the Hunterian, because there was a fallback on, we've always displayed these things, what's the problem now, coupled with, but the whole museum is problematic, which is true. So the situation of a sign becomes interesting, and it's difficult because you might want to bracket the whole thing off as problematic. But yeah, that's as much as I wanted to say there.
Thank you. That's a gentle reminder for everyone as well. The Q&A button is at the bottom if anyone would like to ask any questions. But I guess next again for Nicky and Lola, if ideal display of them right now, if you could do it all differently, what would that look like?
Yeah, I would do it very differently, very differently. To begin with, I do think that we now have a much better understanding of how these things were made, what was the process, but also how much more conscious about the way that these things have to be displayed, about the audience, about the reactions. I think that is something that I was not that much aware back then, or maybe I was dealing with so many objects. I didn't pay the attention. I think that was part of the problem, was shortening 400 objects. It just was what it was. But I also think that one thing I learned over the course of the past years in working at the Hunterian is how important it is working collaboratively. And it's not just with colleagues like Nicky and Sophie and any wonderful colleague in other museum, but it's also about audience and how to work with them. And like, you know, the kind of workshop that you are describing, Sophie, that you have the chance to have with some members of some community groups, that would have completely changed. And yet I think that you never get to a successful or perfect. I mean, like Nicky said, you always have, you risk to upset somebody. But I think that making all this work is something that I would definitely have done, that regardless of what, if there are people there have a positive or negative reaction, I think that is something that going forward, you can't possibly do anything like that without this kind of working.
We've just had a couple of questions come up in the Q&A. If the panelists are ready to answer some questions, I'll start to read them out. Brilliant. So the first one is from Farida Lafan, who asked, do you know if there was any conversation when the casts were made about the ethics of displaying this material? Presumably, given that they were medical tools, the people making them didn't think they'd be shared with the general public.
We don't know, but we assume not. I mean, the idea here is that we think that, my thinking is that Hunter might have been overviewing the process, but it was surely a team of cast makers, professional cast makers, probably people related to the art world, making this cast. And I also think that I'm quite positive that when the casts were finished and when they were made and painted, the corpses had been decayed long before, and I don't think that there was any conversation about that. I don't know, what do you think, Nicky, about it?
I think Sam had a response. I saw something flicked up in front of me saying, you're shaking your head, was that?
It's just indicating to everyone it's being answered right now.
Oh Christ, goodness. Well, the issue of things which were teaching collections and hence were never particularly intended for a wide or general public is obviously a big problem with anatomy collections, and it's a big problem with all sorts of stored collections or research collections, the function of which was never particularly primarily to be displayed, but it's particularly problematic with anatomy collections. And sure, it does affect their meaning, and it puts an extra impetus on us to think really carefully. I mean, in response to Sophie's question, which Lola answered about how you display it differently, at the time of this like short /0 notice redisplay and trying to put some better labels up, it was a really difficult period, and feel quite upset about it all, to be honest. But at the time, I said what these needed to be is to be contextualized properly. We need a bigger display of these items with other different sorts of medical models and other different sorts of like phantom obstetric phantoms, for instance, but also 20th century teaching models. And I'd been reading Carol Adams on the sexual politics of meat. But then when I'm listening to Sophie talking about how like one object is overwhelming enough on its own, like you don't want a display that's got seven or eight different things, even if it's teaching an extremely interesting history. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad I'm not dealing with them anymore, to be honest.
Brilliant. So I'll move on to the next question then. So I'm going to pick up on Richard Bellis here. So he's posing a question to you, Nicky. The comment is that Richard is very intrigued by your comment that more knowledge about human remains doesn't necessarily lead to justice around their curation. Richard is asking, could you please provide a bit more detail there? And is the idea that more research needs to be accompanied by concerted efforts to improve justice around these issues, or something else?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's contentious, and we can disagree. I think what I'm trying to push back against is an idea that having done a lot of violence and harm, the possibility of doing more invasive diagnosis or scraping away or sampling or chopping of both human and animal specimens is the way to kind of remediate for past practices. I mean, so this is when I'm talking about that, I'm trying to make a connection between the way in which people like me and Lola have responsibility for 18th century anatomy collections and how we might have responsibility for 18th and 19th and 20th century natural history collections too, or collections of ethnographic material that has been stolen or taken at great cost or unethically researched. And so the answer sometimes is not don't do more research, just give it back. And in fact, we can't give it back until we've done more research is often a very convenient conservative argument. But I'm trying to suggest that I think you can choose to treat with care a past person just from an attitude, just dispositionally. You don't have to know their name or know more about them. And in fact, so much of the language of finding out about people from the past is so deeply problematic. Let's find out about their genealogy or their stock. I mean, that term stock is literally used describing these 18th century women. I was just like, could we just not? So trying to argue against a kind of unreflective 18th century Enlightenment notion that more knowledge is always good, or that more knowledge is never political, and more knowledge is also political. So those are kind of my thoughts there, Richard. But I mean, it's a really good question. And
Brilliant, that's a fab answer. Thanks so much. So moving on to the next one, I'm picking up on a question from Jim Seckard here, who says, central to the issues here is the fact that these casts are so visually striking, even from a distance. What difference does it make, in your experience, in dealing with objects, and especially texts, that are equally disturbing, but not so visual in character? Are trigger warnings more important then?
Lola, Sophie?
I think I will defer this to you. I do encounter anatomical, I think that anatomical specimens are the most difficult ones, and I do encounter them, but not as often as Nicky and Sophie, as they are historians of science. So I really think this is for you guys.
I think you're very much right. It's one of the reasons, for instance, we gave a kind of trigger warning at the beginning of this presentation, is that different things will always affect different people in different ways. But specifically, I find the kind of dehumanizing language and the examples that Nicky gives about the history of the labels quite upsetting. And I do know that Nicky does such a good job when you teach this material about making sure, like we've done today, that people don't have to engage in it if they don't wish to, really. So giving them the option to maybe dip into the resource if they also feel like they have the capacity and interest to do so, but that making sure that we can still have meaningful conversations about that content without forcing you to engage in it.
And I think presumably Jim's making the point that sometimes a text can be, yeah, like it jumps up on you literally, and it's only after reading it you realize, or parsing it or making sense of it semantically, that its violence becomes apparent. And that's library displays absolutely need to think through that kind of thing too. And yes.
Brilliant. Fab answer from all of you. Moving on to another question here from Scott Keir. Scott asks, was there an issue for either or both galleries of an attitude somewhere of, if you're happy to see some anatomy, you must be happy to see all of it? If so, how to encourage understanding that audience responses to anatomy are a spectrum?
I guess I'll go first quickly because I know we're as just someone who's not we are not an anatomy museum, but we do have examples of anatomy. But doing an exhibition that's branded anatomy, we did have a lot of discussion about if you're going to see an exhibition on anatomy, how could you possibly be upset about seeing anatomy? But I think, as Lola said, you are, and Nicky, actually constantly surprised by what people are upset about and what are issues in exhibitions. But I think for us, these casts particularly hit a lot of tick boxes of things that we knew our visitors have found upsetting in the past and likely would again. But I know it might be different in an anatomy museum.
In our case, the art gallery is not an anatomy museum at all. And actually, one of the challenges of this show was that we were displaying everything from coins, medals, insects, ethnographical objects, books, rare books, manuscripts, everything and anything. So it really was completely out of the context. But then the other thing is that, to follow up on what upsets the people, one of the things that I was surprised about in my conversations at the Center for British Art was that for some people, and this is all very valid, for some people, the naked breast of the women was already quite upsetting. And that is anatomy. I don't know. I mean, you can see that in paintings in any art gallery. So, and a spectrum indeed.
Yeah, I think thinking about a spectrum is a really helpful thing, but also just thinking that consent is a thing which can always be withdrawn. So the argument, well, if you like this, you must like that. That doesn't work. I might have changed my mind, or now I'm traumatized. So I think framing a response to those kinds of things in terms of consent is probably the most a useful approach, I would suggest.
Well, I think that's our time for this session. I just wanted to say a big thank you to Abigayle for helping us with the slides and Q&A today. A big thank you to Lola and Nicky for doing the session.
Thank you for all the attendees for coming. Those really great questions. Cheers, folks.
Thank you for being there. Thank you. And thank you, Sophie.
And it's nice to see some names I haven't seen in a while. Anyway.